All right.
Maybe.
We'll start back again slightly earlier since I made lunch so absurdly long. I don't apologize for anything. So it gives me great pleasure to introduce another of our 61 colleagues, Dr. Marcel Keller, who joined us from Bristol last year, and is going to talk. I didn't read your talk title. I presume it's Pure Multi-Part Compute related.
Yes, so yeah, you assume so very correctly. So my talk is going to be a bit different because I'm a cryptographer and, or more precisely, someone who's doing secure computation. So that's the lens I see the world through, and not so much kind of how good is the linkage. So when I joined Data 61 and I looked a bit at what people are doing there in a confidential computing team, aka N1 Analytics, I thought like, oh, I can, I don't know, I can kind of use my stuff and try something out, and yeah, I had to figure, well, I didn't really want to go for the full Monty, and I will explain it. I will explain why. So in a couple of slides. So that's why it's kind of more MPC or perfect security and like less good linkage, just some sort of linkage, maybe. Okay. Part one.
Any more caveats?
Any more? There was a bit of noise out of the speaker. Any more caveats? Yeah, we'll see. I mean, yeah, I say perfect security, but you will see how I mean perfect and how I do not mean perfect. Okay, part one. Secure multi-party computation. Basically, this is a very general cryptographic primitive, or basically in its generality, you could almost say like the most general of protocols, if you will. And essentially what you want to do, you want to compute on secret data. And what is secret data? Well, secret data is that, well, somebody has the data, but they don't really want to give the data away. So, but you might still kind of want to compute on it in the sense that there is secret data from several parties, and you want to compute on the combination. And in like most generality, well, like in this case, in this illustration that I got here, you have three parties, and they all have their data, and you want to compute the function on that data, but exactly like not giving that data away. And sort of like a way of thinking about it, and also the way how we model this more mathematically, is essentially you want to replace a trusted third party. So trusted third party would be whatever, say KPMG. Other companies are available where you give all your data, and they're like very carefully. Pardon? Of course, yeah. Everyone gives them the data, and they do the computation, and they publish or return the result. But then they will throw the data away, and they will like stay there with sealed lips, and like nothing will leak. But we want to do away with KPMG, at least for the purpose of multi-part computation. Of course, not in general, maybe. So the general question is, I mean, overall, well, how many parties, and then how many of those parties do we consider to be honest, in some sense, and that already leads to the next question, like honest in what sense? And the big question there is like, well, if they're not honest, are they still following the protocol, or are they also trying to do whatever nefarious things they can think of in the protocol? And then these questions sort of overall in the MPC land are called like the adversary model, and this is sort of like a very core part of MPC. And what I'm doing here, because it gives you a nice result. Well, I look at all this landscape with all these potential models. It could be like what's called a malicious adversary, so that's the kind of things when parties are not bound to follow the protocol, and then there's this other divide between honest majority and dishonest majority, and I'm going for the weakest of all of these. So I say, well, okay, let's only have a semi-honest adversary, so let's assume that even the corrupted parties follow the protocol, and at the same time let's have an honest majority, which means that we have an absolute majority of parties that will follow the protocol, and that mathematically immediately requires that you have at least 3 parties, because otherwise you could tolerate 0 corrupt parties, and then things get a bit too easy, even for my taste. And the cool thing about the honest majority model is that there is a sort of like less need for what I would call expensive cryptography. And by expensive cryptography, you essentially can think of public key cryptography, but public key cryptography in the sense that for every bit of extra computation, you sort of need to do extra public key operations. So obviously, or maybe not so obviously, but in particular with an honest majority, you need to have secure channels, and that will usually imply using public key cryptography, but that will be more on a setup level, and then as you go along, it's only symmetrically cryptography to encrypt the actual data. So I promised perfect security earlier, and then now I'm like, yeah, let's do this like weak and cheap thing. But the cool thing is that it's still kind of very clearly defined, and if the assumptions are met, there is a mathematical proof that this computation will not leak any inputs or intermediate data, and only the final output that you actively choose to reveal. And I would like to contrast that with solutions that my dear colleagues have come up with, where there's like all these clicks are being published, and it's not, at least not formally clear how much data that reveals. Of course, there is investigations, and it doesn't easily reveal data, but on the other hand, it's also pretty hard or seemingly impossible to prove that actually nothing is revealed. So this is what I mean with perfect security, like different approach. So for the next couple of slides, I want to familiarize you just like with the very basic, gives you a rough idea what actually can be done in MPC. And then in the second part, I will talk what I actually do in terms of linkage. So to start with something that you hopefully are familiar with, an encryption scheme comes with an encryption algorithm and a decryption algorithm, and you have the ciphertext C and the key K, and then you decrypt it and you get the message M. And now the definition, if the scheme is worth anything, is that obviously the ciphertext doesn't give you any information about M, or slightly more cryptographic terms, like according to some distribution, yada yada, this is distinguishable from random information, or effectively can be generated from the message length only, and apart from that, yeah, just looks random. And key, like obviously there is nothing about the message in the key alone, because that's just a random bit string, or if you're talking about something more mathematical, cannot generate it by a random element in a field, and so on. So if you just take this and split K and C and give it to 2 different people, like none of them will have much useful, because one of the people will have a ciphertext. Well, what can you do with ciphertext? It's like you can sit on a wire, sniff all the ciphertext you want, shouldn't give you anything. On the other hand, key also just a piece of random information. So you can effectively kind of give away M by not really giving away N, just kind of sort of splitting up the information that is required to have N and to do different parties. And this is sort of like at the core of secret sharing, except, as it turns out, you can actually do away with the whole encryption-decryption scheme. And to kind of slowly segue into that, we're gonna say, well, just think of the one-time pad. For those who are familiar with the concept, this is essentially what's called the information-theoretic encryption scheme, where the key is as long as the ciphertext, and what you do is just XORing. And well, at least for a cryptographer, it's obvious. Well, you get like you generate the key at random, and then the ciphertext will look just as random as long as you don't know the key. So again, you can do the same as if you were like using like a more widely used encryption scheme. You can split up K and C, and that will constitute a secret sharing. So basically now it's like the magic, ta-da! Like no more encryption scheme, just shares and a message, and the shares are chosen at random, subject to this constraint that when you XOR them, you will get out M. So this is essentially same. And then from there you can take it a bit further, and it's like, well, we can XOR two values. So if you can XOR two values, you can also XOR three values. And obviously it's very easy to generate such a secret sharing in that, well, instead of just starting with a random S1, you start with a random S1 and a random S2, and then you compute your S3 according to your constraint, and then you can split the whole thing among three parties. Going from there, the one last step that will come out why this is useful in just 2 or 3 slides is essentially, well, if you do that, you can actually also give away 2 of those shares to a party, because then any one party will lack one of the shares. So if I'm getting S1 and S2, I still lack S3, and S3 kind of entirely depends on the message, and by generation S1 and S2 are just random bit strings, so that won't obviously give me anything. And this is what it's calling cryptography a replicated secret sharing, and that's because obviously like each one of those 3 shares will be given to 2 parties, and that will turn out to be very useful in a short time. Are there any questions so far? Okay, so now, we saw the sharing. Now the question is, well, how about the computing? And then there is like the first and easy step is like, well, so XOR is commutative, so XOR of XOR and XOR of XOR and XOR is like, it all permutes. So basically what we can do with our shares, we can just XOR shares together, and this will actually then give us a sharing of the XORs of the secrets. Because, yeah, XORs, you can just move, you can just like move your XOR summons around, if you will, and like that's very straightforward. But of course, XORing alone doesn't give you that much. So you want to at least have some other operation to complete that, and it turns out this other operation is AND, because XOR and AND together give you completeness for computing binary circuits. Kind of thinking ahead a bit, but now back to how do we do ANDs. So if you look at the left-hand side, this is what you sort of want to compute. So you have 2 values, an X and a Y, that are secret shared in this XOR manner. So X is X1, XOR X2, XOR X3, and Y is Y1, XOR Y2, XOR Y3, and you want to compute the N of those. And then the equality signs is just kind of straightforward, sort of shuffling around. Here, sort of making use of the fact that XOR and AND is the same as addition and multiplication in GF2, so computation modulo 2, and also modulo 2 is only 0 and 1, so that's a bit like bits. So you can kind of use the mathematical tools if you don't want to engage in truth table computation, which of course would also be an option. And then you can figure out these operations. I mean, like the first equality is just straightforward associativity, and then the second one is like a bit more, and then moving things around. And then the cool thing is that you have those 3 lines. So like you have that what you want is an XOR of 3 bits or bit strings more generally. And if you look at the indices on the first lines, the indices are all 1 and 2. On the second line, it's all 2 and 3. And on the third line, it's only 3 and 1. And this exactly corresponds to the sharing scheme that I told you about 2 slides ago, in that party 1 gets share 1 and 2, and party 2 gets share 2 and 3, and party 3 gets share 3 and 1. So each one of these lines can be computed locally by the parties, and the result, they will get the what's called like the additive secret sharing, because now you don't have this replication. So every party just has 1 share, and the XOR of all the shares will be the actual secret. But well, if you already have the additive secret sharing, it's not really hard going to replicate it. Sharing, basically, you just kind of forward it. So basically, if I'm party 1 and I should have 1 and 2, but I only have share number 1, well, party 2 has share number 2, so party 2 could just send me their share, and then I have share 1 and 2. And this is what I try to indicate by those diagonal arrows. So basically, you send the share that you get out to the party to your whatever, left, right, depending on how you put those people on a plane, and then you got the sharing again, that is basically the desired sharing, and that basically allows you to kind of go on with further rounds of computation of any kind, being XOR or AND. Only small problem, we would like to be these things to be kind of uniformly random, and this is not really the case when the Zs are the result of this computation, but there's also an easy solution to that. We can kind of re-randomize like with another sharing that is a sharing of 0, and that can be generated with some key setup, so that's a bit more of a technicality. So, but about halfway through my talk, more or less, in terms of time, we can conclude, yeah, there is a way of doing this kind of computations on secret information. We can do XORs, we can do ANDs, and hence we can do all binary circuits, and hence we can do all computation, at least in theory, because in practice it also means like, well, if we have to break down all computation into binary circuits, we can't really use RAM, and that's kind of annoying. So it is theoretically feasible. In practice, it really depends, like how, like what your actual computation is, and how, yeah, like what your actual computation is, like in terms of the size of your data, and in terms of like how involved, how RAM-y, if you want, your computation is, and there's like all connected to all sorts of things, because like it's very much of the similar nature is that, well, in RAM computation you can have branching and you can have if else, and you look at your data and then you do one branch or the other. In circuit computations you kind of have to do always the same branches, and this is exactly because the parties that participate in a computation know what computation they engage in, because you know, are you doing an AND or an XOR? So basically, if you would do branching on secret data, the branch that you're in would kind of give away potentially some secret information. So this is not directly possible. I mean, there's like tricks that you could think of, like kind of trying to make the branches look as much the same as possible and things like that, or like universal circuits where you don't know exactly like what you're doing, but this is all an additional layer of complexity. You have to do more computation. So it's not really like a what's called the panacea. It doesn't solve all the problems, but you can do something. So let's try and see what we can actually do, or what we can do fairly fast. And basically, the thing, without knowing much of the linkage literature, this is essentially what I came up with. Is that well, I learned about CLK, so that was sort of like my starting point. So we have from two sides, we have two lists of CLKs describing entities, and we want to have the set of the best matches. But then already, like having computing a set, the set is already like a RAMI data structure. So yeah, maybe not so much. So let's just see what else. So maybe we just do like a matrix of the best matches for one side. So create a matrix of size n times m, when n and m are the two input sizes from the two databases, and we will guarantee that per row of the matrix there is at most 1 1. So basically, and that 1 should be in the column that it corresponds to the best match. So how do we do that? Essentially 3 steps: comparison, sanitization, and aggregation. Where essentially comparison is about what we do on a pairwise basis, on how we deal with one pair of CLK. Then there is some sanitization step to make sure that things don't get like too weird, and I will talk about that in 2 slides time. And then there's the aggregation, kind of putting everything together. So 1, 2, 3. 1. So we've seen that XOR is really cheap, so we start with a lot of XORs, like lots and lots of XORs, because yeah, we can do those locally. There is no communication involved, no communication runs, so it's kind of nice. So, well, unsurprisingly, if we have some CLKs, we XOR the CLKs, and this is the starting point to compute the Hamming distance between the two CLKs. Another nice trick that I use there is a way of like computing the Hamming weight of a value with like sort of the minimally needed required computation, where you essentially start with well, you have these bit strings, and then you just add like the bits in this bit string, sort of pairwise, and then you get your output will be at most 2, because you have at most 1 plus 1, which is at most 2, but you already have like half as many values in the range from 0 to 2, and then you just continue on that route. You add 2 values that are at most 2, and your result will be at most 4. And so on, and so on, and so on. And in the end, you will have a binary representation of the integer that will represent your Hamming weight. So that's one cool thing. And then, of course, like basically all on the rock and behind the scenes is sort of like the involved trickery of like getting those things right, and also executing as much in parallel as possible, because obviously this is all highly parallelizable. Like we can compute every pair of CLKs, the Hamming distance of every pair of CLKs in parallel. And if you remember like how we did the AND, that involved a a round of communication, it's sort of obvious that you want to, at least to some extent, like aggregate your ends together so that you're not for every simple, tiny computation step that you kind of want to send something on the network and then wait what comes back on the network. So this is like the whole, I mean, it's sort of like the whole trick of the software that I'm using, or like a big deal of the trick of the software that I'm using is like putting those ends together. Okay, so that was step number one. Now we get to sanitization, and this is essentially just something that I did. I should say, like, I did all this without looking at any actual data, because this doesn't inform the running times in any way, because the way you compute is like you compute on random data due to the nature of secure computation, so you don't really need real data to get any meaningful timings results. So that's pretty much like done everything in a vacuum, if you will. But one idea I had that, well, the best match for one entity on one side, if there is this entity is not present in the other database, I mean, even the best match could be quite bad, so that's something that we probably don't want to have in the output. And especially this could, and like due to its nature, because it's a one-sided matching, it's like for the B side, there could be several matches, and you also kind of want to like reduce that. So what we simply do, we define a threshold for the Hamming weight, and says like, well, for the Hamming distance, if the Hamming distance is above this, it's not a match. And again, that is something that can be done relatively easy in secure multi-party computation, because it's only a comparison essentially, and a comparison circuit is not too involved. And again, it's highly parallelizable because it can be done for every pair in parallel again. Okay, and now sort of like the pièce de résistance, if you will. It's like the most involved part is that we want to, per row, we want to aggregate all these CLKs to find all the Hamming distances that we computed to find this to find the best match. Well, if there's any, and then we just like end with all the sanitization data. And at the core of this is a tree-wise aggregation. Well, we'll call it as basically due to the circuit nature, you kind of like in MPC really like this kind of tree-wise things, because it's kind of a very local atomic operation where you have like two inputs and you have like one output, and then you kind of do that as a whole tree. So the question is like, what is this core operation? And if you think like you kind of do it on like a left and the right side, representing like an arbitrary number of entities from the B side, because we have like fixed an entity on the A side. So we like, that's the landscape we're in. We have fixed an entity on the A side. We have two lists of any numbers of entities from the B side, and they come with the minimum Hamming distance for the two parts, and bit strings sort of indicating the best match. So this recursive algorithm, if you will. So like we assume that you've already like done it, or at the starting point, of course, you will have like two lists of size 1. So obviously the best match is just this one entity, and also the bit string indicating where this will be just a single 1 bit. So how do you aggregate? Well, obviously you get those two Hamming distances. You have to compare the two Hamming distances. This gives you like a bit 0 or 1, and you then want to aggregate and get a new bit string of the length of the addition of the input bit string, and of course the overall minimum. I'm actually jumping ahead because now we're on the have want slide, so that's what we want. And how we do it is that we do the comparison between the Hamming weights, and this will kind of like give us 0 for one case and 1 for the other case. And then we use a few what's sometimes called like MOOCs gates or MOOCs functions, which essentially is a selection function. So you have the special input bit B kind of determines which of the other 2 inputs you will get. And if you want to phrase that out, that is this formula is like one case XOR B and the difference, if you will, like the XORs of the 2 inputs, and it's relatively easy to see. So basically, if B is 0, and now we kind of understand B as extending to a string of the right length. If B is 0, we get dr as the output, so that's line number 2 there. And if B is 1, the output is dr XOR dl XOR dr, so it will be dl. So we will have effectively, as a circuit, computed a selection of the inputs dr dl. So, and I think that's like pretty much there is to understand. We select the output Hamming distance according to the comparison of the 2 input Hamming distances, and we select the output string, kind of like for the first part, we select between this string that we had on the input from the left that had like 1, 1, and otherwise all zeros, and we select between that and the string of all zeros. And then we do kind of the other way for the thing the other way around for the second part. And of course, this will guarantee you that the output is, well, like first of all, a string that is all 0 but 1, 1. And then of course that 1, 1 is of course in the right location, and that's all we wanted. And then we just kind of do that for every entity on the A side. Like we do the whole tree, and we get like per entity on the A side, we get this row that has exactly these guarantees of having well 1, 1, and then if we end together with the result of the sanitization, we get that we have at most 1, 1 per row, and that 1, 1 is in the right place. And that more or less on time finishes the description of the algorithm. And now just for a few results benchmarks, I ran this for like 1,000-bit clicks, or maybe 1,024, because that's a bit easier with the tree. I don't remember, to be honest. I took some fairly beefy Amazon machines with wait, is it 30? Yeah, I think that those have 36 cores and 72 gigabytes of RAM, and like a smaller example for 5,000 times 5,000 entities would run in a few seconds and send some gigabytes, whereas like a more realistic of like 10K, basically the more or less in terms of orders of magnitude largest one that I've managed with the implementation that I had was 10K times 100K, and that took a few minutes and over 100 gigabytes per party, because you can imagine for any sort of computation you will have a decent number of ANDs, and every AND means 1 bit being sent per party, if you remember that slide. And yeah, that's about it. Code is all public, admittedly not very well documented, but the most important thing is this Blink binary linkage.mpc program that you can find on the N1 Analytics GitHub. Thank you. Of course, I'm happy to answer any questions.
So I'm sure everyone's impressed by 8.5 seconds for your linkage there. Could you remind us how long the offline phase takes?
Oh, that's offline phase 3.
Okay.
Because
Could you explain?
that's basically because there is just so that's a really big divide between honest majority and dishonest majority. And because I went for the cheap one, the honest majority, there is not really that much of a point to having an offline phase because there is no like what I called expensive cryptography. So this is the whole thing. Like with like sharing your inputs or like basically kind of assuming that the inputs, the two lists of inputs are like held by one of the two parties, and they have to kind of share it at the beginning of the computation, and then they compute all of it, and then I think I'm not really sure if the result gets published or not, but that complexity of that sort of like pales in comparison to everything else, so it wouldn't really make a difference. But yeah, no pre-processing.
And the second question, are the random, sort of adding extra random information as you're going through the circuit, is that done locally as well, by the different?
You mean the re-randomization after the end?
Yeah.
Yeah, that is so.
And the follow, I mean, I assumed it is, and like the follow-up is like, is there any do you have a problem with like bandwidth generating good quality random information on the nodes, because like generating good quality random information is like random bits is hard. I presume you just seed a random number generator, like a pseudo-random number generator. But,
of course. Like, of
even
course.
getting the seed for that can be a big bottleneck at some point.
Well, I mean, you only need to get the seed once.
Yeah,
so, getting a decent random seed versus a computation that lasts seconds or minutes, it's not that much. Very valid question about the pseudo-random generation. I usually kind of look when I develop something like that. I usually look a bit at a bit of profiling, and I think kind of like it doesn't show up massively. So like I mean I don't remember for this thing in particular, but generally when it comes to those things like one computation doesn't differ that much from the other computation. I would say what I remember is it comes down of like 10, like in the lower tens of percentages, mobile computation. So it is it leaves a mark, but in the end there's also the whole administration around like running the virtual machine, the machinery, and so on. So it's not really that it dominates the whole thing by 90+%.
If the parties aren't co-located on Amazon, then you've got the overhead of the communication of 100 gigabytes potentially.
Exactly. Yeah, exactly. So basically that, sort of like the time cost, if you can kind of evaluate it, I looked at it, and essentially sort of the communication cost for this admittedly local communication versus the computation cost, it's like sort of like balanced as well. So basically looking at how much time you spend waiting on the stuff coming in versus how much time you spend on actually computing. I mean, there's like none of them is like sort of like again, taking something in the 90% mark, it's more like, I don't know, 50-50, 40-60, like 30-70 at worst. And if you care about the re-randomization, I mean, the trick is like really easy to explain. So basically you have a pre-shared, you kind of share the random seed between every pair of parties. So that means like every one party has like two seeds, so you're on like two PRGs, that gives you like 2 bits, and then you just XOR the 2 bits, and that will kind of give you, I mean, everybody will then have like 1 bit, and the XOR of all of those single bits will exactly be 0, because every output of the PRG like appears on two parties. So that's in MPC terms, that's called like pseudo-random zero sharing. And yeah, so like all the time behind you, they're key. Add some questions.
Silly question. So I kind of got a bit lost in the middle. So basically, are you saying that you have 2 parties and they compute their clicks, and then you do the distance calculation using this SMC framework, doing the
Yes.
right?
Yeah. So basically, that's basically the click computation. Like, is assumed to be an input. And like one thing that I should have said there. So like I'm saying clicks because that's something that I assume people in this room know. But it can be like any string describing your entities in any way because it's not revealed. So it can actually be way more revealing than a click. It doesn't really have to be Bloom filter, like whatever. It just has to be, like the more bits they have, the more expensive the computation gets.
Yes. I guess which is my question. I mean, if you can do that, why not just deal with the original records and the origin distance function on those records?
Yeah. I mean, but then, I didn't run the numbers in my head, but like a whole name and an address and the date of birth, like probably comes out a bit more than 1,000 bits. But maybe I'm just guessing.
Having a constant size binary representation that is, as we heard earlier, can give you the same accuracy is a very convenient starting point. Like it's just an embedding, right?
I mean, in fact,
you can copy this.
You want to think of
I always have to think of a colleague, and his name is Muthuramakrishnan Venkita Subramahamian, something like that. And I guess you wouldn't really need his whole name to make a matching. Like probably after a dozen characters or so, you could as well cut it off. And he calls himself Muthu, so. Sorry.
So you just want some encoding technique which actually is as faithful to the records as possible, rather than anything like Bloom filters that loses information.
Yeah, exactly.
So you had a fairly you have a very precise definition of the security model, but you choose a very lax one, so it's not a very strong one. So how would your numbers change when you ramp up security? So are there like deal breakers or like hurdles that you have to jump over at some point?
You have to think overall in terms of in several order of magnitudes, whereas and a thing. So there's two things. So there's those two dimensions. There is the kind of the corruption and the number of the corruption. And if you go from honest majority to dishonest majority, then this expensive cryptography comes in, and then you have to expect, just top of my head, at least two orders of magnitude slower. Overall, then would do then with a pre-processing phase, and then the online phase would be maybe about the same order of magnitude, but the pre-processing phase would be way more expensive. What was it talking about? Yeah, that was honest versus dishonest majority, and then active versus passive security, or the kind of corruption that tends to be kind of a bit more benign. Maybe you can get away with one-ish order of magnitude. There is this one caveat for this particular implementation though, is that it is harder to get, it's more expensive to get malicious security with bitwise computation, because it's, in simple terms, it's easy to guess one bit, because there's other computation domains are available. Or for example, you can do compute so-called arithmetic circuits modulo a large prime. And due to the fact if you have a 128-bit prime or so, it's really hard to guess an element of an element in a field modulo 128-bit prime, and that gives you actually very nice checking strategies that you're not really given in the realm of bits. So this is kind of an extra factor there.
Very interesting. If anyone does want to follow up on more, let's do that afterwards.